Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Naroditsky's Opening Lab. In this video, we're going to be tackling one of our most daunting enemies to date. We are going to be demolishing the Danish Gambit, which has terrorized black players for well over a century and a half. The Danish is one of the reasons why a lot of players are afraid to play e4, e5, and I think it's on par with openings like the King's Gambit, and even with more reputable lines like the Scotch and the Italian. It's a very, very serious opening. It's not just a gimmicky gambit, and you absolutely have to know a lot of theory in order to avoid losing the game quickly. But worry not, my promise in these videos is one and the same. If you invest the requisite time, if you listen to the video carefully from start to finish, you will never have to fear any of these openings again, and the Danish Gambit is no exception. I will show you in this video how to get a reliably better and sometimes even winning position against all of the varieties of the Danish Gambit. I will show you how to neutralize White's initiative and how to grab all of the pawns that White offers and to get away with it in style. But we've got a lot of work to do. The Danish Gambit is very theoretical, and there's going to be a lot of variations and ideas in this video. As usual, I'll try to make it palatable. I'll try to make it as entertaining as I can. And remember, you can always pause, set the position up on your own board, and you can do some supplementary analysis if anything I say is not clear, or if there are any moves that you're wondering about. I will try to be, as always, as comprehensive and detailed as possible. So without further ado, let's jump in, and let's start with a little bit of context and definition. What is the Danish Gambit? So the Danish Gambit is defined by the following moves. White starts with e4, we respond with e5, and White enters the center game with d4. White actually gives up 3 of his pawns in rapid succession. This is the first of them, and after Black captures, White can take back on d4, but this is the center game. It's largely frowned upon, and it will be the subject of a separate video. White enters the Danish with the move c3, gambiting the first pawn. This very much resembles a Smith-Morra type idea, except against e5 rather than c5. And after Black accepts the pawn, which, by the way, is not forced, and I will quickly offer a practical alternative with the move d5 in a little while. But if Black takes the pawn, then White is at a further crossroads. White can recapture on c3. This is not very common, and yet it's a line that has to be examined carefully. I will still lump this in the general Danish Gambit category. Here, White only gambits 1 pawn, and White tries to play this much like a Smith-Morra, bringing the bishop out to c4 and the knight out to f3, aiming for quick development. But the far more common and traditional treatment of the Danish Gambit involves gambiting the second pawn with bishop c4. White brings out the light squared bishop onto an optimal square, staring at the f7 pawn and offering Black a second pawn. And if Black takes it, White finally recaptures the pawn, which started out on e5 and ends up on b2. And in return for the 2 sacrificed pawns, White achieves a big lead in development. Both of White's bishops are now developed onto optimal squares. The dark squared bishop is staring right down the barrel of that long diagonal, looking hungrily at that g7 pawn. And it's very clear, even with an untrained eye, even if you don't know any theory, that White has clear and evident compensation for the 2 sacrificed pawns in the form of better central control. White has a pawn in the center, Black doesn't. And of course, the main draw, the main appeal of the Danish Gambit is White's big lead in development, which can lead to rapid victory if Black is not extremely well-versed in the ensuing theory. But again, don't worry. All you will really have to remember are the subsequent 3 or 4 moves. If you understand those moves and their attendant ideas, then you will send the Danish Gambit right back where it belongs. And I don't know where I'm going with this. I don't know where it belongs. But in any case, let's jump into the theory. The Danish, by the way, has been around for well over 150 years. For a little bit of context, it was first played around 1850. In fact, funny bit of trivia, the first time the move c3 was played was 1839 by none other than Captain Evans, the same guy who developed the Evans Gambit in the Italian. So this guy was a trailblazer. He was ahead of his time. In that game, Black ended up declining the Gambit with knight f6. The first time the traditional Danish was played was not by a Danish person. It was by a Swede, a guy named Hans, not Niemann, Hans Linden in 1863. And then shortly thereafter, a lot of the top players, including Zukertort, the world champion contender, as well as Joseph Henry Blackburn, the top English player, they hopped aboard the Danish Gambit train with great success. And by the early 1900s, the Danish Gambit had sort of entered the regular rotation of a lot of the top players who really saw in it an opportunity to score tons of quick victories. Remember that back then, people didn't study openings quite as seriously. There wasn't as much knowledge to go around. And so Zukertort, Blackburn, Steinitz also played at Alekhine, and others scored just countless 15 move and less victories in the Danish Gambit. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. After white plays the move c3, black is not obliged to accept this first gambit. In fact, there is a very practical alternative that I'm not going to discuss at length. I'm going to give you the sort of TLDR version of this alternative, but the appeal of having this option in your back pocket, and I'm talking about the move d7, d5, counter striking in the center, is that it takes the fun out of the Danish Gambit for white. I've talked about this earlier. Gambit players don't like it when you decline their gambits and get sort of a dry equal position. They want something fun. They want to sacrifice one pawn or two pawns or three pieces or however much they're trying to sacrifice. And so having an alternative like this in your back pocket is a great idea. The move d5 leads to an equal position, but I actually think black's practical chances in the resulting position are more comfortable. So I'm going to give you a sort of 5-minute elevator pitch of the move d5, and then I'm going to move on to my main recommendation. If you actually want to get an objective advantage against the Danish, then you in fact do have to accept the gambit with pawn takes c3. So the point of d5 is obvious. Black opens up the center and counter strikes on the e4 pawn. White's hand is essentially forced here. White has to play e takes d5. Although online, tons of people make other moves here, which is a little bit weird. There's moves like e5 and knight f3, which I won't even talk about. I want to remind you that there is a link to a Lichess study that contains all of the variations that I'm about to show and many others. You can find that in the description to this video. So in that file, I more comprehensively examine some of the third and fourth rate options in a lot of positions. In this video, I try to hit on the most important points. So the only semi-viable alternative to e takes d5 is queen takes d4. And this is like an inferior version of the center game. Black responds with bishop e6. I think it's an interesting way to support the d5 pawn. And after the trade on d5, black gets a development advantage, the opportunity to bring the knight out with tempo, and there's no question that white is struggling for equality. If white chases the bishop away with c4, black is not obliged to move it. Queen e7 check gets the queen out of the x-ray exerted by its vis-a-vis, checks the white king, and after bishop e3, bishop e6, black has a great position and a furious initiative. Something like knight c3, the knight comes out, the rook comes to d8, and there will be hell to pay because white is just woefully underdeveloped here. So e takes d5 is the only serious option. We take back with the queen. Now, again, white has a couple of second-rate options, but virtually everybody captures on d4 with the pawn. We respond to this with knight to c6, and you might find this position similar to an Alapin Sicilian. It is very similar to an Alapin, the difference, of course, being that rather than a pawn on e7, there is now a pawn on c7, and I actually think this makes white's play quite a bit more toothless. The Alapin, as you might know if you watch the speedrun videos, is a very, very legitimate opening. So knight c6 hits the pawn on d4. White has to defend it with the move knight f3. And here, there is really only one move that you have to remember. If you're looking at this for the first time, you might think that bishop g4 is the most reasonable move. But in fact, my recommendation is to check on the other side. Bishop to b4 check with a very straightforward idea. After white covers with the knight, we no longer have to move the queen away from d5 because the knight is pinned. So now we have a little bit of time that we can use to bring our other pieces out. Now we play bishop g4, pinning the other knight. The bishop's kind of crisscrossing the knight on both sides. We're threatening to capture the knight and capture the pawn on d4. So if white plays a passive move like bishop e3, we absolutely take white up on their offer. We play bishop takes f3. And after something like gf castles queenside, again, we don't have to move our queen until white plays a3. in which case we do take the knight on c3. White's kingside is in shambles, the d4 pawn is weak, and after something like a3, pawn takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, knight f6, white has just a terrible position. Our rook's coming to e8, and White's king has no safe haven on either side of the board. So rewinding back to this position, bishop e2 is essentially forced. And now we do a slightly weird-looking procedure that basically forces an endgame in which I think Black's chances are slightly preferable, even though the computer evaluates the position as equal. And this might seem too good to be true, and yet this line is in fact virtually forced. This is why I'm deviating from my standard procedure, which is only to recommend one line, and I'm kind of giving you this line in the event that you don't want to engage in tons of theory, or let's say you're playing a bullet game and you want to play something more practical and easier to remember. Now we take the knight on f3, and we do that in order to open up a square on c4 for the black queen. It may seem weird to give up the bishop pair, but notice what we're doing here. We're preventing white from castling kingside. That would be illegal. We are attacking the d4 pawn two different ways, but we're also attacking the knight on c3. So we're creating essentially two threats at once, and white has no choice here but to liquidate and give up the bishop pair with bishop takes c6 check. There are just no other moves. The only other move played with any kind of regularity is queen to b3, offering the queen trade. We are more than happy to trade queens, and we reach an endgame in which white is saddled with the permanent weakness of the d4 pawn. Our pieces are very well developed, and most people who've had this position slide into a really, really bad position very quickly. For instance, if white castles, we castle queenside, and d5 may seem like a scary move because we lose a7, but with the queens off the board, we have nothing to fear. We jump into d4 with the knight. After rook takes a7, we get a liquidation followed by a better endgame for black. We snap off the bishop on f3. We take the knight on c3. The check is nothing to fear. After b takes c3, knight takes d5, black has a clearly better endgame. White's pawn structure is ruined, the check is innocuous, and if white plays c4, we could even throw in the move king to b8, forcing the rook out of the 7th rank. Then the knight entrenches itself on b4, and black has a very pleasant position. This actually occurred in a high-level game between two strong female players, Maric and Veroci, all the way back in Belgrade in 1989. So queen b3 is nothing to fear. In the Lichess file, I give a couple of other options, such as bishop e3, to which we respond bishop takes c3. We accept the sacrifice, and white has nothing to write home about here. And so the main move by a country mile is to play bishop takes c6, eliminating the knight. Now, taking with the queen here would be very short-sighted because it would allow white to castle, and that's exactly what white wants. So instead, we take back with the pawn. We need to maintain contact with the f1 square in order to prevent white from castling, and yet again, we're essentially forcing white's hand. We're threatening bishop takes c3. Move like bishop d2 is bad for several reasons, one of which is that we don't even have to take on d4. We just castle queenside, and rook e8 is coming with devastating effect. So white essentially has to trade queens if they know what's good for them. We accept the trade, and we get this very balanced endgame in which both sides have obvious detriments in their pawn structure. Of course, we have the damaged queenside pawn structure as a result of us taking back with a pawn, but white is saddled with the long-term weakness of this isolated pawn on d4. And I'd also point out that white's king is far from safe. It's standing on a file that can easily be accessed by black's rooks, and a lot of games to reach this position actually end up in a direct attack against white's king. So the game is likely to continue. Bishop e3, we bring our knight out to f6, and black's play here is really, really easy. We bring our rook over to e8, and if white is not careful, once again, he can slide into a really bad position very quickly. For instance, if white moves the king away from the pin, we were threatening to take the pawn on d4. We entrench our knight in the center. We're trying to rectify our pawn structure after knight takes d5, pawn takes d5. If white plays rook hd1, then he is already worse. We take on c3. We move our rook forward to d6, and that attack I mentioned has become a reality because the rook is going to slide over to f6 with check. We're going to try to send the king back over to e2, and then we can use the pin against the bishop to mount direct pressure against the bishop or the pawn that's going to take its place after we trade the knight on d5 for the bishop. So This line with d5 is what I would call a takeout line. It basically guarantees a good, solid position, and it takes all of the fun out of the Danish Gambit for white. And so I've decided to dedicate a little bit of time to it just so you have this line in your back pocket if you want to play something a little bit simpler. So once again, there's a lot more detail in the study that you will find in the description, but hopefully this gives you a suitable general overview. So once again, we play d5, counter striking in the center. After the trade on d5, the only important moves to remember, first of all, are bishop b4 check. We want to start specifically with this move. After knight c3, the other bishop comes out, so remember that the queen is not hanging. And after bishop e2, the second move to remember is bishop takes f3. Seems counterintuitive, but we're sinking our teeth into the c4 square. This virtually forces white to liquidate into the endgame that we reach after bishop takes e6. Now, pawn takes to keep control over the f1 square. We get this endgame. This endgame is very easy to play for black. So that's the takeout line with d5. Now, let's get to the meat of the video. Let's get to the big boy stuff, and that would be pawn takes c3. So again, buckle in because there's going to be a lot of theory here, but I will try to emphasize the moves that you really have to remember, and I will try to present this in a relatively digestible manner. But as I said at the start, don't hesitate to pause the video. Don't hesitate to break it down into multiple chunks. Opening study is really tough. I don't sugarcoat that in these videos. I just try to give you the stuff that you need to know in order to get good positions. So first of all, we need to tackle knight takes c3. And this move is orders of magnitude less common online than bishop c4. I'm talking something like, I think, 1.5 million games on Lichess versus 7 million with bishop c4. So you're a lot less likely to face this move. And yet from an objective standpoint, I actually think knight takes c3 might be better than bishop c4. So here, it's very important for us to develop our minor pieces in the right order. And what we want to avoid is the tempting knight f6. It's actually a terrible move because it walks right into e5. This is what white wants. And the knight doesn't have any good squares. It has to retreat back to g8. And then black is immediately in huge trouble after bishop c4. What we want to play here is bishop to c5. We bring our bishop out first, kind of violating the opening principle about knights before bishops. But in a lot of these gambits, general opening principles go out the window because we have more important things to attend to. We play the move bishop c5, and we quickly solidify the bishop with d6. So we actually delay the development of the knights because, well, the knight on g8 is very susceptible to this move e5. So we want to prevent that move, or at least take the sting out of it before we bring the kingside knight out. So generally, white plays bishop c4. There are no other reasonable moves. If white plays another developing move like knight f3, this is very likely to transpose back into the main line because eventually white's going to have to bring this bishop out, and there are no logical squares other than c4. If white makes a passive move like bishop to d3, then you can just develop your pieces with knight f6 and castles, and white has limited to no compensation for the pawn. So bishop c4 is the only serious option. And you should notice that this actually creates a tactical threat. White threatens to take on f7 and then to fork the king and the bishop with queen to d5. And so we have to solidify the bishop with d6. So we defend the bishop, we open up a pathway for our other bishop, and we obviously render bishop takes f7 check useless. We also render queen d5 useless because it doesn't attack this bishop any longer, and we can simply defend the f7 pawn with queen to e7, followed by bringing the knight out to f6. And so white generally continues to develop with knight to f3. What's interesting is that the only way for white to avoid a clearly worse position is this computer move queen to b3. This doesn't happen very often, and yet it's a very important move to know because it creates a rather nasty threat of bishop takes f7 check. And this is not the easiest pawn to defend. Generally, the way that you would want to do it is to go knight h6, but here, clearly this move is ineffective because white can snap that knight off the board. So you might say, well, let's go queen e7. But the issue with queen e7 is that it runs into the super nasty knight d5. We're paying the price here for not developing our knights. And after queen takes c4, knight e2, the position is wildly chaotic. This is exactly what we don't want. This would play into white's hand. So instead, the move that you have to remember is not queen e7, not queen f6, but queen to h4. absolutely crucial move that takes this line completely out of commission. We create a counter threat on f2. Guess what? 2 can play at that game. And at first sight, this move may seem absurd because white just takes on f7 with check, but extend this line one move further, and hopefully you're beginning to see that it is white who's in serious trouble, not black. White is completely overextended. We're attacking the f2 pawn. The bishop on f7 is, dangling by a single thread. It's only protected by the queen, and white has a hard time keeping everything under control. G3 is the only move that has featured with any sort of regularity online, and yet it loses the game on the spot. Perhaps you can pause the video and figure out where the queen should go and why white is already losing after the next move. And I'll take this opportunity to watch you suffer and drink some water, Agadmatter style. So the answer, of course, is that the queen slides back to f6. Now's the time. And this is a simple fork. We're attacking the bishop on f7, and we're attacking the pawn on f2. White has no choice but to move the bishop to take the knight. Bishop e3 has been played a staggering number of times. Here we can obviously just take on f7 or take on e3 and take on f7. White has no compensation for the piece. So bishop takes g8 leads to disaster after queen takes f2 check. Now we calmly recapture the bishop on g8. We have not only an extra pawn, but obviously a completely decisive attack against white's king, which we can further by bringing the bishop out to g4 at the right moment. Now, after knight g2, the right moment has not been reached because we need to keep an eye on the b7 pawn. So first, we develop our knight, and after white develops their bishop, I don't see any other reasonable moves. We drop our queen back to f3. This is a very precise move, going after the rook, and also setting up a pin against the e2 knight. So the idea is revealed if white moves the rook away. The knight jumps into d4, and black has just a completely winning position. You can follow up by bringing the bishop out or continuing to chase the queen after something like queen d5, c6. So white can also try the move king to c2, but now the knight jumps into b4, sending the king back toward the first rank. King can't go to the first rank because white loses the rook with check, so white actually has to give away the queen. Now white does recapture black's queen with rook hf1, but when the smoke clears, you should see that white will end up down in exchange. We give the queen up for the rook, we slide the king over to e8, and white can continue the tactics here with knight to d5. But yet again, this is nothing to fear because we're up so much material that we can afford to give some of it back. We take on d2, white takes on c7, and temporarily white has reestablished material equality, but not for very long, because after we drop our bishop back, the knight is completely and utterly helpless. And we're going to trap the knight with a variety of different techniques. We can play b6, bishop b7, or we could bring the bishop out to e6 and then slide the king up to d7 and win the knight that way. And if white tries shenanigans with rook f7, we intercept the rook with the calm bishop d7. Then white is totally helpless. Let's make a random move. The simplest option here is just to go king c8. We're actually going to use our king to trap the knight on a8. But before we go king b8, we're going to move this bishop out of the way, bishop to d7, bishop to e6. And regardless of where the rook moves, our king reaches b8 and white's knight is lost. But all of these last moves are pretty easy to find. The crux here is to remember the move queen h4. That was a long line, and yet it's relatively forced. So I decided to go pretty deep in this very important variation. Again, you have to remember the move queen h4. You ignore the threat on f7, and you pose a counter threat to the f2 pawn. Now, that isn't the whole story. White, of course, can play the move g3, and white should play the move g3 if he knows what's good for him. But having induced this weakness on the king side, we now return to f6. Here, black is sort of stably up a pawn for absolutely no compensation. And the only important thing to remember here after the move f4 is this move queen back to e7. So I know it's a weird, slightly computerish queen maneuver, but hopefully all three of these moves make sense. We play queen h4 to attack f2. We drop our queen back to f6 to induce the move f4, and now we drop our queen again for a very simple reason. We're trying to stop the knight from jumping into d5, and we're opening up a more natural developing square for our knight. So with knight d5 impossible, white has to develop their other pieces. We do the same with something like knight f6. In a lot of games online, continued e5. Now the pawn is pinned, so we can just exert more pressure on it with the move knight b to d7, and white is already collapsing from all sides. Remember that black is up a pawn to begin with, and now after d takes e5, we win another pawn. And if white tries to go for rapid development, we keep the e-file closed with the move e4. And we use that pawn as temporary cover. We use it to castle kingside. Now black's king is completely out of the woods, and white's bishop is very much in the woods. In fact, it's trapped after e3. This is an online game that we've been following. The Lee chess study goes on after this moment, but I think that's enough. I think you get the point. So g3 walks into queen f6, then the queen shifts back to e7, and black gets a great position. According to the engine, the only way for white to maintain a playable position is a move that almost nobody online has played. You're never going to face this move. It's the move queen c2, which I've given an exclamation mark. It's utterly, ultimately illogical, because the whole reason you brought your queen to b3 was to put pressure on f7. Now suddenly you're moving the queen away from c2. So I won't devote a lot of attention to this move in this video. I analyzed it in great depth in the PGN that's attached in the description. The only thing I'll say is that the next move is queen to g4. There's some really, really cool play with the queen in this line, and largely we're using our queen to provoke weaknesses on white's king side to make it difficult for white to conduct the attack on the other side of the board. And after f3, our queen goes back to h4, more weaknesses are induced, and then all the way back to d8. We're saying, guess what? If you're not going to be on b3, then we don't have to keep our queen in the vicinity of the f7 pawn. And if white goes back to b3, now we go around to d7. So we defend the pawn this way. Having induced all of these weaknesses, our queen finally retires on d7. Note that bishop b5 does not win the queen. It actually loses a bunch of tempi to c6, and after knight ge2, we can finally focus on developing our pieces. White's position here is just on the verge of collapse. Knight a5 is threatened. Knight e5 is also a devastating threat. So even if white finds this crazy computer move, white is still facing a pawn down for absolutely no compensation. And so that concludes our overview of queen b3. Now let's get to the move you're going to face a lot more often, which is knight f3. White continues to develop their pieces, and so we continue to develop ours. Having prevented the move e5, we bring our knight out to f6. After white castles, we do the same, and essentially we are just up a pawn for very, very little compensation. White has a tiny bit of compensation because he's got a little bit of a lead in development, but with some more accurate and careful moves, we're able to completely neutralize this lead in development. Importantly, the move e5 is never dangerous as long as we have a pawn on d6. It actually only plays into black's hands by allowing a queen trade. We play d takes e5, and after the trade of queens, white can create a one-move threat on f7, which we easily parry with the move bishop to e6. And after the trade, white has a miserable task ahead of him, just a pawn down endgame for no compensation. So instead, most people play bishop g5 here, and the only thing that you should remember is to bring this knight out, not to c6, but to d7. If you understand what white wants, then this move should be very obvious. White wants to play knight d5 and exert pressure on the f6 knight. This is really white's only asset in this position, and so we link the knights up to take the sting out of the move knight d5. If white tries this move anyway, then we can chase the knight with c6. That's the second reason that we don't occupy the c6 square with the knight. We want to play the move pawn to c6 in order to fully restrict the mobility of white's knight. So if white plays a move like rook e1, then we take this opportunity to play c6, and the knight never has another active prospect ever again. I continued the line here with e5. This leads to sort of a mass trade. And once again, after rook takes e5, white has a pawn down in the endgame. And to make matters worse, there is another very cute tactic in this position that merely builds on black's material advantage. Maybe you can pause the video once again, see if you can spot this straightforward tactical shot. You should notice that a king on g1, the rook on e5, they're almost unforkable squares, and you can make them get to forkable squares. The bishop takes f2 check. And after the smoke clears, knight to g4 check. Looks like black is losing the rook in return, but you have to calculate one step further. It's the bishop on c4 that is hanging. This gives black 2 extra pawns for absolutely no compensation. Note that the Desperado sack, bishop f7, actually makes things worse because after knight takes f7, we're also simultaneously defending the rook. So that's just one sample line in which white ends up with a miserable endgame. So back to this position after knight bd7. In the file, I also analyzed a move like queen c2, which we can meet with, or no, I analyzed, what else did I analyze? Rook e1, I looked at knight d5, c6, and some alternatives on this move. Here I considered e5 once again. But long story short, black is up a pawn. There's absolutely no compensation. And after something like queen c2, we go h6. We can strike at the center with d5. And this is a practical move because we're actually giving the pawn away in order to reach a long-lasting initiative, something that Gambit players absolutely hate. They hate to be the ones that are fighting against the initiative. So for instance, e takes, c takes. White can play the move rook a d1. We get our queen up to d6, getting out of the pin against the knight. And yes, white recaptures the pawn with bishop f6 and bishop d5. But now we drop our bishop back. We bring our other bishop out. We have a bishop pair, an initiative against white's queen. And according to the engine, black has a very stable advantage. So this is the way in which you neutralize the immediate recapture on c3. So important points. First of all, you need to remember the move bishop c5. Do not bring either knight out. It's very important to get this bishop and solidify it with the move d6. And this is done in order to take the sting out of the move e5, which otherwise would be very dangerous. So I should also point out that after bishop c4, d6, the move e5 does absolutely nothing, but not for the reason that you might think. Do not take on e5 here. That plays right into white's hands, and it walks into this very nasty tactic, bishop takes f7 check. And instead, you can exploit the undefended nature of white's bishop. You can play a move like knight c6 and just bring your pieces out, or you can initiate a cute tactic with bishop takes f2 check, followed by queen h4, and then you recapture the bishop with just an overwhelming advantage. So e5 is never scary. I analyzed it in a couple of different positions. I analyzed it here, but here you just take on e5, and you can always bring your light squared bishop out to e6 at the right moment to neutralize its counterpart. So first thing to remember is to play bishop c5 and d6. The second thing to remember is after white brings their bishop out to g5, you actually play knight b to d7. Yes, you're blocking your light squared bishop, but it's a lot more important to keep this knight on f6 well defended, and to make sure that white's knight is restricted after a well-timed c6. And the final takeaway is that queen to b3, which can catch an unprepared player unawares, is met with queen to h4. This move is going to win you some games because I'm almost certain that people are going to excitedly take on f7 and say, what are you doing? You don't know what you're doing. After queen f6, turns out that white's the one who doesn't know what they're doing, because you're going to win f2 with a devastating attack. And so that means it is time for us to move on to the traditional Danish gambit with bishop c4. And it'll turn out that this is quite a bit easier to master than knight takes c3. The line that I have come up with is not only rare, but I think it's objectively best. And if white does not respond with filigree precision, you're actually going to get a winning position out of the opening. So I'm super, super excited to be sharing this line. You start by accepting the second sacrifice. And there's quite a bit of misinformation in this position. When I was a kid, my first coach shared with me a piece of wisdom that's often considered to be kind of a given, which is that the best way to neutralize the Danish is to play this move d5 in this position, sacrificing the pawn back in order to open up a diagonal for black's bishop. And the wisdom goes that after bishop takes d5, you're supposed to go knight f6. You sacrifice the second pawn back as well. And here there is a little bit of tactics. King takes f7, queen takes d8. You win the queen back with a bishop b4 check. White drops the queen back to d2 to get a piece for it, and you reach this endgame. But when I started looking at this endgame with the computer, I found that black's position is actually really, really unpleasant. I think white is better from a practical standpoint, and even if he wasn't, we don't want to fight the Danish gambit from a position of weakness. We want to fight it from the position of strength. We don't want to just give away the 2 pawns and hand white a legitimately good position in the endgame. We want to challenge gambits like this in principled fashion. And so the move that I am recommending is knight to f6. This is, of course, a very popular response to the Danish. We bring our knight out, we attack the pawn on e4, and your first reaction might be, well, wait a second, didn't you just say that the move knight f6 should be avoided in these types of positions? So it should be avoided if white has a knight on c3, and that is the chief difference. Almost forced is the move e5. You're going to encounter this move, I think, in 95% of your games. Of course, white has a couple of alternatives. I looked at really bad moves like knight d2, which is obviously ultra passive. And here you can give back one of your pawns with d5 and then put your bishop on d6. White has zero compensation for the pawn here. I also looked at the move knight to c3, and here also you can give back the pawn with d5. So this idea in general is really, really good. It's just you don't want to play it prematurely. And here the point is, if white plays knight takes d5, you trade knights on d5 and you open up this very nice check on b4. Then you chase the bishop away with c6. And bishop takes f7 check just doesn't come with the same effect anymore, because here, after king takes f7, notice that the queen is defended. White can win the bishop back with queen b3 check, but when the smoke clears, black has a very, very nasty check on d3. This forces white's knight out to e2, and now we bring our rook over to d8. There are some beautiful tactical ideas in this line. So that's why I ultimately decided to recommend d5. And one of them is, after queen takes b7 check, here the best move is knight d7, which flat out leads to a winning position because there's the threat of rook a b8. White is just totally paralyzed here. White can continue grabbing pawns, but after rook a c8, the game is totally over because the rook is getting to c2. But if you want to be cute, you can also play the move rook to d7. Unfortunately, this doesn't win the game on the spot, although it maintains a much better position. But after queen takes a8, you have a really, really pretty checkmate with queen d1 and rook takes d1. Unfortunately, white can play queen b4, and this staves off defeat because the queen can block a check on d1 with queen to e1. So if you want to be objective here, you want to go knight d7, and white is completely busted. But you know, plenty of cute tactical tricks for black as well as for white in the Danish. So knight to c3 can be very effectively met with d5. If white takes with the pawn, I mean, this is never dangerous because now the bishop has been taken out of commission, and you almost always meet e takes d5 by putting your dark squared bishop on d6, just to make sure that white can't re-sacrifice the d-pawn and open up the diagonal. And this position is, you know, clear without much analysis. We bring the bishop out to g4, and black has just an overwhelming position up a pawn and excellent development. Knight c3 is not dangerous. Knight to d2. Knight f3, similarly not dangerous. We deliver a check on b4, and if white continues developing nonchalantly, then white has just allowed us to get our king out of the center. And after white castles, we can actually take the third pawn with knight takes c4. Yes, white has this development advantage, but 3 pawns is way too much of a price to pay for measly compensation. White has no tactics here. Bishop g7 doesn't work because our knight drops back to f6 at the end of the line. And after the bishop moves back, we get our knight out. And it's not hard to see that white just doesn't have any targets. There's nothing to attack after something like rook e1, knight f6. Knight g5 looks scary, but we intercept the bishop with d5. And the line goes on. Here we have the very powerful move knight to g4, sacrificing h7. And much like in that knight takes c3 line, we have queen to h4, which comes at the worst possible moment for white, forking the h2 and f2 pawns. So this is not scary. And if white takes on h7 with the bishop, then our king uses the bishop kind of as an umbrella. The knight on g5 is hanging, and if white defends it, then we would want to start here with the move queen to d6, attacking h2, inducing a weakness. And now we play the move f6. This wins the game on the spot because white is unable to save both the knight and the bishop. White has to sack the knight. And remember that you can use the d5 pawn as a blockader. You can push it to d4 at the right moment in order to block the dark squared bishop. So for instance, if white drops the bishop back and you reach this position, white now threatens queen h5 check, followed by queen h7 checkmate. And you can't block the check because that knight can be captured. This is a perfect opportunity to play the move d4. This shuts down white's attack immediately because now the check is safely met with knight h6. White doesn't have queen takes h6, and you're going to play bishop g4 on the next move and repel what remains of white's initiative. So you're not going to face any of these moves with any kind of regularity, but it's worth knowing what to do. So knight c3 and knight d2 can be met with d5. Knight f3 can be met with a check on b4. And so now we get to the fun part. We get to e5. Here, you respond with a check on b4. This is compared to the sort of more common d5 and like knight e4, this is a pretty rare move online. And what I love is that in the vast majority of games that feature this move, white responds with a line that I can only call losing. It's not an exaggeration to say that the vast majority of games enter a line that straight up loses for white on the spot. What I like about bishop b4 is that it poses white with an immediate dilemma. White basically has 4 viable ways to defend against the check. I'm not going to look at queen d2. I'll let you analyze that on your own. So white has the following options. There's king to f1, moving the king away. There's knight to c3, which is by far the most common move, and this basically loses on the spot. We'll get to that in a moment. There's bishop to c3, which is the least common of all the reasonable ways to block the check, and yet it is the only way for white to preserve a feasible position. White is still worse in this line, but if you are a Danish player who wants to meet this line effectively, you have to play bishop c3. In every other line, black's advantage is nearly decisive. And then, of course, there's also knight d2, which is the second most common move after knight c3. This goes down in very similar fashion. So let's tackle these moves one by one. We're going to end with bishop c3 because it is the least common move. I'm not trying to hide the best move from you. I will show you white's best line. And even there, white gets woefully insufficient compensation for the pawns, but at least the position remains a little bit more combative. Let's start with the exciting part. Why does knight c3 lose? So a crucial part of black's strategy here is to make an important move in this position. You might say, well, the knight is hanging. We have to move the knight. Let's go knight e4. Knight e4 is a bad move, not because of queen d5, but actually because of bishop takes f7. Super common resource in the Danish. We've come across this move already, and white is able to pick up the knight with queen d5 check. Black's king is going to be in a lot of danger, so don't go knight e4. Don't go knight g8. What is this hidden move, which a lot of players greatly underestimate? Another good opportunity to pause the video. By finding this move, you're going to really chisel it into your memory. You're going to make sure that you never forget it again. So I'll give you the opportunity to do just that. Black to play and completely neutralize white's initiative. This is a move that you should kind of know instinctively if you've studied the theory of an opening like the Scotch Gambit. In the Scotch Gambit, white plays knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6. Now white plays d4. Now the traditional Italian, of course, is d3 or knight g5. d4, e takes d4, and white pushes the pawn through to e5. And black's main response by far is to counter-strike in the center with d5, counterattacking the bishop on c4 and opening up pathways for black's bishop on c8. And this is the exact same type of principle. We dial it back to the Danish. After cb, knight f6, e5, bishop e4, knight c3, we do the exact same thing. We push d5, and by doing so, we completely neutralize white's play in the center. This move may seem to lead to a lot of chaos, but in fact, it wins the game very, very cleanly. And here's how. After the move e takes f6, we do not take on c4. This is what most people expect. White players get excited at this because the pawn lands on g7, the queens are traded, and the black king lands on a very awkward square. No, no, no. We avoid all of that with a 10-foot pole. Instead, we play queen takes f6. And look at this. White's two minor pieces, the knight on c3, the bishop on c4, are both hanging, and white doesn't have any ways to defend both of them at the same time. If white throws in a check on a4, not dangerous at all due to the move knight to c6, and white is back to square zero. If white delivers a check on b5, we respond with c6. In fact, bishop b5 is the only way to really stave off the game, although it's almost never played. Black's going to recapture either the bishop or the knight. We're going to keep, at the very least, an extra pawn and a superior position. So, for instance, after knight e2, we play c takes b5. Then we develop our knight to c6. Notice that there is no effective discovery against the black queen. If white plays knight takes d5, we take the bishop. We do not fear the check on c7 because when the smoke clears, our pieces are so much better developed. We just massacre white on these open files and diagonals. f3, our bishop drops back to e6. And after rook to d8, white's just going to lose the knight on e2. And with it, white's going to lose the game immediately. So that doesn't work. What else is there? There's the move rook to b1, which has been played online, and we just completely ignore the threats by castling. And after knight takes d5, queen h4, black has retained 2 extra pawns, and white has virtually 0 compensation. If white takes on b4, of course, we recapture with the knight, and bishop a3 is calmly met by a5, in making sure that the knight on b4 is safe. There's not much to say here. Black is just 2 pawns up on the queen side, and white's compensation has evaporated entirely. Knight ef4 allows us to drop our bishop back, and here, similarly, white has nothing going for him on the king side, and we can solidify the bishop by playing b6. So bishop b5, relatively best, but still not very effective. Other moves that have been played online, knight e2 is, of course, very common. And here, once again, we take on c4, then we castle. So an important pattern is that there's almost never an effective discovery because the bishop on b2 is unprotected. And once again, if white tries knight d5 and then rook b1, then we drop our queen back. We're already up a piece. So we give the bishop back up, and we're just completely and totally winning here. Here, black is up actually 3 pawns. So there isn't much to talk about. If white plays knight takes c7, this is laughably innocuous. We can win the game in a variety of ways. We can play bishop g4, drop the bishop back. Notice how we're inducing the move f3. And yeah, congrats, you've taken the rook, but just look at what's going on white's side of the board. We're winning all of white's pieces. We're pinning and winning and skewering absolutely everything. Not much to talk about here either. In the file, I look at a couple of other moves here, but suffice it to say that there's really not much to analyze. And the best piece of news is that queen e2 check is the most popular move. I've already said the words loses on the spot. The computer evaluation here is around plus 1.5 plus 2, which is borderline decisive. After queen e2 check, by far the most common move, it's around plus 5 because this allows black's bishop to come out to e6. This merely throws more oil onto the fire. Now, white can't even put the knight on e2, so there's no good way to defend the knight on c3. Most people desperately play bishop takes d5. Of course, here we take the knight with check, and the game is over. A lot of games ended this way. The rook on a1 is lost with check. If white castles queenside, well, that is pretty pathetic as well. After bishop takes c3, bishop takes b5, the simplest approach is just to trade all of the pieces on b2, trade on d5, bring the knight out, and white is up. White is down 2 pawns for absolutely no compensation in the endgame. So this is, this gets me excited because this is just so incredibly common online, and it basically loses on the spot. Just to rewind a little bit, in this position, of course, e takes f6 is not forced. There's also e takes d6, but this makes very little sense because black just recaptures the pawn and that's it. White's compensation is totally gone. The only thing I'll point out is that knight to c6 here is a nice move. This is a pattern that you may have noticed. Giving up the f7 pawn is very typical in these Danish Gambit lines because white is often struggling with a lack of development. So the bishop on f7 becomes more of a liability than a strength. After knight e2, knight a5, there you go. The queen is severed. The connection between the queen and the bishop is severed, and black picks up the bishop with just a completely winning position. So e takes d6 makes very little sense. Some other moves are analyzed in the file, but I think that's enough on knight c3. If bishop b5 check occurs here, then black can play either knight fd7 or the simplest option is c6. This will transpose into the line that we've already looked at after ef6, queen f6. Remember, this is where we were looking at knight e2, and then c takes b5 followed by castling kingside. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, is the most common move. Knight to c3 is simply met with d5. The second piece of good news is that knight d2, the second most common move, leads to similar types of positions. Here we still play the move d5. And in contrast with knight to c3, after e takes f6, we don't have the option of taking on f6. Obviously, here we do take on c4, and we do allow white's pawn to reach g7. But that pawn is a lot less scary than it may appear. The rook on g8 is a very secure blockader. It can't be chased away. And of course, the pawn on g7 is a weakness. Black is threatening the move c3, and we have, for goodness sakes, a 4-on-1 on the queen side, and that is just completely and utterly overwhelming. White's pawn on g7 is far from sufficient compensation for the material losses. So I analyzed this position in detail. Rook c1 is the most common move. If white develops nonchalantly, then he walks right into c3. Notice that a check on e2 is never dangerous because we bring the bishop out to e6. So that doesn't help. Some people have tried this. Here we can still play c3. And if white plays the sort of cutesy bishop c3 and knight e4, then, well, that ain't going to cut it, because the absolute simplest approach here is just give this bishop away. Don't bother with moves like bishop d4. And this is another pattern that you should be noticing as I'm showing you these lines. Here you pick up g7 with a completely winning position. In the Danish, white often sacrifices so much material that there comes a point where the best strategy is just to sacrifice a little bit of it back, right? If you're up a piece and 3 pawns, give away the piece and make sure that your king is safe. That's a much more practical approach than trying to cling at all costs to all of the material. And so rook c1 is the only feasible move. Here we bring the knight out to c6, and this is another case in point. We give up the pawn on c4, and we do that in order to gain our own lead in development. We bring the bishop out to f5. The bishop threatens to sink its teeth at a opportune moment onto d3. White has no choice but to continue developing. If white plays queen e2 check, this merely plays into black's hands. The endgame is obviously completely one-sided, and here we still deliver the check on e7. White has no choice now but to play queen e2 because king f1 walks into the fork on d3, or black could even castle immediately. That's even better. And after queen e2, we castle. We trade on our own terms. We get our king to safety. And after the queen trade, all that remains of white's initiative is this pawn on g7, and we are going to surround that pawn at our convenience. So for example, rook f4, not dangerous. We drop our bishop back. Our knight jumps into b4, where it threatens to move into d3, and then it circles back to d5. And at the right moment, we can just calmly play the move f6, even if it comes at the cost of the a7 pawn. When the smoke clears, here material is actually equal, but white's position is lost because black's pieces are so incredibly active. We've got the g-file, we've got the bishop pair. White's pieces are totally discombobulated. The engine evaluation here is around -2. White can barely make a move. Rook d1 runs into bishop c2, rook e1 runs into, well, doesn't run into anything specific, but now we can walk our rook back to e8 and contest that file. We can do a lot of different great things in a position like this. And so knight d2 is without question better objectively than knight to c3, but it does not come even close to solving black's problems, white's problems after the move d5. And similarly, if white plays ed, then, well, black takes on d6 with the queen, and this is similarly toothless to this line after knight to c3. And so 2 lines have been covered. That leaves us with the 2 other alternatives. Well, you guessed it, after king f1, you will never believe what black's move is. Once again, we play the move d5, and this leads once again to very similar structures. If white plays e takes f6, this basically leads by force to an endgame in which, once again, white gets this pawn to g7, and it's nothing to fear. Remember, always and always, queen a4 check, never scary, because we bring our knight out to c6, and we simultaneously protect the bishop. And if white goes for the endgame, black puts the rook on g8, and our biggest project here is to isolate this pawn from the bishop. We start by playing knight d7. We need to take away the e5 square from white's knight, and if white jumps into g5, we defend the f7 pawn. If white greedily takes h7, we slice off the knight with f6, then we take on g7. The knight is going to be trapped. And if white brings the other knight out, then we put our own knight on f6 to cover the d5 square. So there's a little bit of hot water here, a little bit of turbulence on board, but once we get our bishop out to e6, white's initiative fizzles out, and his position is simply losing. I analyzed a couple of options here, one of which is knight e6 and knight e4, kind of a tricky looking move, trying to get black to take the rook on e1. Don't do that, because white will take on f6 with check. Instead, we take the knight, and we bring our rook over to d8. Now it's time for white to experience some turbulence, and that turbulence is going to cause a crash. Black plays b5. Remember, we've got a 4-on-1 on the queen side, and once the bishop gets to d2, the game is over because the move c3 is finally unstoppable. So notice that the pawn on g7 this entire time has just been sitting there. It's totally innocuous because the rook is on a light square, and the rook from g8 cannot be dislodged. So conceptually, you might understand that black is much better, but I also want you to understand that these endgames are really nothing to fear if you memorize just a couple of accurate moves. So finally, and yes, I'm wearing different clothes in this part of the video because I was recording this video over the course of 2 days, so you can kind of adjust your eyes to the new environment. But finally, we have to check the best move, unquestionably the best move for white in this position, which is, of course, bishop to c3. And it's important to emphasize that not only is this the least intuitive of white's options, because the whole point of the Danish Gambit is that the dark squared bishop is one of the engines of white's initiative, and here white gives this bishop away, but also it's staggeringly infrequently played. This move is almost never played when you compare it to the more common knight c3, knight d2, and king f1, all three of which are more popular than bishop c3. In the text file, I have some statistics. Yeah, it looks like bishop c3 has been played in only 2,500 games on Lichess compared to 40,000 in knight c3 and 22,000 in knight d2. So it's important for me to frame this by saying you're likely to never face this move, but that doesn't mean you don't have to know what to do against it. You absolutely do. A well-prepared opponent will play bishop c3 in this position. So what is the idea of bishop c3? Well, the idea is that after the trade, you're taking the sting out of the move d5. In fact, black can still play the move d5 to liberate some of these pieces, but I analyzed this, and after ef, dc, fg, this is a significantly inferior version for black of a type of position that we already saw. So for example, in the king f1 line, if white plays king f1, we know that we play d5. And if you look at this endgame, here the knight is not developed. Here black's bishop on b4 is controlling critical square. So this is a really, really bad version of this endgame for white. Whereas in the bishop c3 version, that endgame is a lot less clear. And that is why my recommendation is to avoid that endgame altogether and to play the very powerful move queen to e7, which does a couple of things. It pins the e-pawn, making e takes f6 illegal, and of course it guards the bishop on b4. So if white takes on b4, that would be a very bad move. After queen b4, knight d2, the knight jumps into e4, and black has a major initiative. The line goes on. White can take on f7 and then win the knight back with queen f3, but when the smoke clears, black is still up. What is black up? Black is up a pawn, and white has absolutely no compensation. The queen trade is coming next, and black can always deploy the light squared bishop by fianchettoing it with b6. So bishop takes bishop is not particularly good. White has to know to play the move queen e2. And here we make a move that you might be very apprehensive about playing. But remember that white is not all that well developed. Both sides have their dark squared bishop developed, and white just has the other bishop developed. But it's not like white's lead in development is overwhelming. And that is why we can afford to play the move knight to g8 in this position. That doesn't mean that something has gone wrong. This is simply part of the analysis. The knight is just redeployed. You're dropping it back to its initial square, yes, but you're going to redeploy it onto h6, which might seem like an awkward square, but from h6, the knight is basically unassailable. It controls some of the center. It can jump into f5, and we quickly finish developing our other pieces. Remember that black is up 2 entire pawns. So it turns out that white is not able to develop fast enough to punish black for our temporary lack of development. So the line continues, knight f3. We redeploy the knight with knight h6. White castles, and this is what almost everybody does. We castle as well, so we simply keep the tension on b4. And here I checked a couple of different moves. The most common move is bishop takes b4. If white plays a3 and tries to trade on his own terms, at this point we are happy to take on c3, and we play the move knight c6. And we're going to get almost exactly this position. In fact, we are going to get exactly this position through a slightly different move order. The same thing happens if white first takes and then plays a3. We drop our queen back to e7, and here we get exactly the same position. And here it's important that we simply continue our development. We are not fearing the move knight to d5. And black's idea in this position is very simple. We need to get rid of the e5 pawn. If we can get rid of this pawn signals the last vestiges of white's initiative. So if we can trade that pawn off with the move d6, black is likely to simply emerge with 2 extra pawns for no compensation. So if white plays a move like rook fe1, then of course we take the opportunity to play d6. And here I analyzed this position extensively, but by and large, black is already much, much better. So the most sensible move is knight d5. We drop our queen back to d8. And now, no matter what white plays, rook a d1, rook fe1, it doesn't matter. Your response is one and the same. It is the move d6, which frees up the bishop on c8 and tries to get rid of the pawn on e5. Of course, if white acquiesces to the trade, then white basically has no compensation for the 2 pawns, and we're chilling. So white's best move is the immediate rook a to d1. Now we can still develop our bishop to e6, but this move is not quite as effective because of this weird knight f4 move. So my recommendation here is to deploy the bishop all the way to g4 in order to put even more indirect pressure on the e5 pawn. White basically has to take on d6, and we take back with the queen. This is another important move to remember because this line, it's pretty narrow, so you're actually quite likely to get this position. C takes d6 is possible, but I like this move more because it sets a trap and it solves all of black's problems. If white plays knight to b6, which may seem to be the biggest flaw of the move queen d6, let's see if you can pause the video and figure out the stunning tactical response which enables black to keep our 2 extra pawns. So hopefully you were able to find that the move is knight to d4. We're intercepting the attack on our queen. We're simultaneously attacking white's queen with check. And after rook takes d4, queen takes b6, that's it. We are fully out of the woods, and we have 2 extra pawns. Notice the role played by the knight on h6, which supports the bishop on g4, and we're threatening queen takes d4 in this position. So knight b6 is not good. If white plays h3, which is the computer move, then we trade on f3, and we play the cold-blooded rook a to e8. Again, there are simply no effective discoveries. It's jarring to play a move like this, but it turns out that white has no discoveries. Knight e7 check seems to win the queen, but again, after rook takes e7, black wins the game because you snap off the rook on e1 and the rook on d6, and black just gets an overwhelming amount of material for the queen. So that doesn't work. The line goes on, but long story short, black is clearly better here. With a couple more computer moves, white can limit the advantage to just a slight edge, but this will involve another 8 computer moves in a row, starting with this move, which I don't think anybody is going to play. This is also already move 20, so we've gone pretty darn far. The upshot is that bishop c3, while it is technically the best move, it does not even come close to solving white's problems, provided that you know a couple of things. The first is this move queen e7. The second is not to be afraid to drop the knight back to g8. By the way, if white plays a3 sooner, you basically do the same exact thing. The third key is that you're not afraid of the move knight to d5. As scary as this move may appear, it's really not all that scary. You can play queen d8 here. You can also, in this particular version, you can slide the queen up to c5 and then over to a5, and this is an even better version of this position. But you can also play queen d8 here. If white plays knight f3, then after all of the pieces are developed, and white gets the knight to c3, you don't play a move like c6 here. You simply get your other knight out, and once the queen drops back, your next move is going to be d6. Then you're going to develop the light squared bishop. And from a practical standpoint, I really don't think that white can demonstrate any compensation for the 2 pawns. I kind of looked at this without the engine, and it occurred to me that after d6, black is just in phenomenal shape. And that means that the Danish Gambit, at least in the traditional way of playing it, has been, let's call it, basically busted. And it's busted by a relatively rare line. To give you the TLDR bird's eye view, we started by looking at the sort of refined, you can call it, Danish Gambit with knight takes c3. And here you have to remember to first develop your dark squared bishop. I've already gone over the small summary of this line. So now let's focus on bishop to c4. Here we grab the second pawn. We refrain from the often recommended d5, which is utterly toothless. We start by bringing our knight out to f6. We goad white into playing e5. Some other alternatives are examined here as well. Knight c3, you can then strike with d5, but e5 is what you're going to face almost all of the time. And this check on b4, this is the check that a lot of people forget to deliver. The point of this check is simply to develop the bishop, and then on the next move, against all options other than bishop c3, we counter strike in the center with d5, particularly after knight c3, which is the most common move we play, d5. And here, the critical thing to remember is to recapture on f6. This basically wins the game because it hits two of white's minor pieces at once. We also looked at knight d2. Here, you still play d5. And the key thing in this line and in the king f1 variation is to realize that this pawn is nothing to fear because black has such an overwhelming advantage on the other side of the board, on the queen side. And here, black has threats of c3. We also examined king f1 here as well. You play d5, bishop b5 check. The knight drops back to d7, by the way. I don't think I mentioned this line, but most people are going to take on f6 and then go into this endgame. And again, the pawn on g7 is going to be slowly but surely surrounded. You're going to try to get this move f6 in, and once you win this pawn, you're very likely to win the game. And we concluded by checking the best move, which is bishop c3 here. As just mentioned, you start with queen e7, and the rest is pretty straightforward. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes our marathon examination of the Danish Gambit. I hope you enjoyed this overview. I'd like to remind you that there is a link in the description to a Lichess study that contains all of these variations and many more, and a lot of textual annotations. So if you've fallen asleep watching this video and you don't want to watch it again, you can look at that Lichess study and acquaint yourself with all of the lines at your own pace. But I like doing these videos because I think for a lot of people, these kinds of overviews, at least for me personally, I like it when all of the major lines are laid out in relatively orderly fashion. Not sure this was totally orderly, but hopefully it did the trick. So on that note, folks, I'd like to wish you the best of luck in busting and demolishing the Danish in your own games. I will say for those who are still here that I will be doing a series of opening videos on Jababa London lines that are not covered in my new course, the link to which is also in the description. So you have plenty more opening videos to look forward to. And of course, the Naroditsky Opening Lab series will continue, and we will bust many, many other gambits. Thank you guys for watching, and happy gambit busting. See you in the next video.